Okay, great. Okay, could you see the next slide, please? Okay, this isn't the first time we've been to Australia. Um, Actually, in 1980, I first met David Harold. It was during a trip to observe a total solar eclipse in India. But our first real trip to Australia was in April 1986 um, when we flew into Brisbane and met Steve Hutchin there, and he drove us up the Queensland coast to Cairns, where we hired a small plane to take us all to an island in the Torres Strait to try to observe an occultation of a star by Halley's Comet, and occultations during a total lunar eclipse that happened at the same time. So that was an interesting trip with a cyclone preventing our sightseeing in Cairns, but so instead we spent more time in Sydney with Dave Harold. Um, then in 2002, our next trip was many years later then when Joan and my son William and I hired an RV in Adelaide, and we drove with Dave Harold up to the set up sites at the northern and southern limits of the total solar eclipse where it crossed the Stewart Highway. I understand, I think, Roger, you're going to be giving a paper about your observations of that event, which were kind of interesting as I remember. Anyway, in 2003 June, I came back to Australia, hoping to observe the occultation of Beta Virginis by the asteroid 124 Alceste, hoping to do it from Victoria or New South Wales, or the path crossed over to Victoria in southern South Australia, but the weather prospects look better, and I went back to Adelaide then and managed to get just one chord rather than two or three, which I hoped to do, but at least that was successful. Finally, in 2007, July, I attended the first Trans-Tasman Symposium on Occultations that was held in Auckland on the northern island of New Zealand for a few days. In February 2009, I flew to Perth and hired a car and drove to Beacon, the small town northwest of Perth, northeast, I mean, to meet David Harold. And then we drove on in both our cars to Kalgoorlie the next day and observed a lunar graze of Antares with about 10 others north of that city. As far as I know, that was the greatest distance ever traveled to observe a graze. And I think the one in June was the greatest distance ever to observe an asteroid occultation. Anyway, the Antares graze was successful, as shown by the reduction profile below. It was mostly cloudy, but we had a break in the clouds, which allowed us to observe the graze, and 10 minutes later you couldn't see the moon. So we were just very fortunate with that situation. But with all these other trips since then, we've always wanted to spend much more time to really explore Australia in detail, and finally now we're doing that. Next slide. I was sort of tied down with the Messenger spacecraft mission because I designed some of the software that's used in the operations for that. However, on April 30th, the Messenger mission ended when the spacecraft crashed onto the planet. And so at that point, I was released from that obligation, and the very next day, we left Maryland, staying in Los Angeles area for one day before going on to New Zealand. Next slide. So we had several objectives of this thing. We want to promote occultation science in the Australia-New Zealand region and learn new techniques from observers there, as we are doing at the symposium. This was written, some of this text was written for the presentation in New Zealand. So there's many special events we wanted to observe and several kind of ordinary ones, but we wanted to take time just to enjoy the sights of the southern skies. And during the travel, we want to sightsee in many parts of the country, develop improved equipment and observing techniques, and look forward to meeting new people and making new friends, which we've already done. And the interesting thing about Australia and New Zealand is everything's backwards down there. They drive on the other side of the street. The locks turn clockwise to close them rather than counterclockwise rather than clockwise to lock them usually. And even the moon and the sky are upside down. But we've gotten used to all those things and really have enjoyed it. We were in New Zealand for 11 days before the long stay in Australia to attend the Trans-Tasman meeting and the RASNZ annual meeting. Next slide. This just shows, our first trip was only in the North Island, so this time we were only in the South Island. The blue line shows the routes we traveled. We flew into Christchurch. I don't know if you can see the cursor, which right near the middle of the figure there. And then we drove southwest from there to Lake Tekapu, where the conference was held. And we also drove on down to Queenstown before the meeting and saw the beautiful countryside around there, the alpine country in that part of New Zealand. And Lake Tekapu, that area is kind of a desert. It's a drier spot of New Zealand, and of course they have the Mount John Observatory, which was celebrating its 50th anniversary. So they had actually 3 meetings: that 50th anniversary, the RASNZ meeting, and the Trans-Tasman occultation meeting. Next slide. So it just shows the program of the RASNZ conference. I gave one talk, the second one from the bottom there, on the second day of the big meeting on molestation deployments for asteroid occultations. Next slide. Then this is the schedule for the Trans-Tasman Symposium. So you can see a lot of our Christo Pavlov, Dave Harold, and other people that you're quite familiar with, Brian Loader, John Talbot. We've all made great contributions to our program. Next slide. This just shows the Trans-Tasman meeting was quite well attended. You can see 27 attendees there in the group photo, and you can see the keys there. So you can just look at that at leisure and identify people you might have known. It was really great to actually talk to many people who I really hadn't met very well before, or renew acquaintances of people who were at the first Trans-Tasman meeting. Next slide. Okay, this just shows another photo showing me, Dave Harold, Bill Hanna, and Steve Kerr. So I hope Bill Hanna was able to make it down to the IOTA meeting there. He was planning to go to it. So he had been living in Alice Springs for many years, but suddenly had to return to the United States permanently. And he left just less than a week, I think, before we arrived. And so unfortunately we didn't cross paths in Alice Springs. But he certainly set things up well for me there. Next, and Steve Kerr now is doing the work since John Talbot had an unfortunate incident in the hospital recovering, and so Steve Kerr is collecting the asteroid occultation observations for the Australia and New Zealand now. And this shows our family when we were at Blenheim in the northern part of our trip, visiting a winery, quite happy there. You can see William in the center and Joan to the left. Next slide. Um, Then on May 15th, we flew into Brisbane and we stayed at a motel at 8 Miles Plains, shown at the north end there, but we did visit around the Brisbane area, we had shipped had a bunch of telescopes and things shipped to Steve Hutchian, who lives in Sheldon, and we got that motel because it was the closest one we could find to his house. So we visited a number of times, and he gave us great advice. And also we made a couple of trips down to Reedy Creek to visit John Broughton, and those were very productive. I'll be talking about the paper telescopes that he built for me and the suitcase telescope that he also built one for me. I had the mirror shipped. They had one 10-inch mirror, F4 mirror that we needed for that scope. There's just one of them available in Australia, in Sydney, I think, and I bought it and had it shipped to him. So, great. Next slide. Then on May 21st to the 28th, we made a side trip to Indonesia. So the purpose of that was to observe the Regulus occultation by Dagmar, which Paul Maley talked to you about earlier, but there was also a second occultation of another bright star just 2 days later, which I'll also talk about. So it was a very interesting trip. Next slide. Okay, of course, this Regulus occultation was visible actually right in the Washington, D.C. area, rather close to our home. But we didn't stay around for it. Next slide. Show that it just didn't work in the Washington area because the sun was 71 degrees above the horizon and the star was only 2 degrees above it. Of course, those are quite impossible conditions. Next slide. Paul already showed you this one, but the interesting thing is on the right side of the path did cross southern Sumatra just before it exited the Earth's surface. So there was a little bit of land there that we grabbed a hold of. We actually got the visas to go to Saudi Arabia, but Paul told us that they couldn't support the equipment, they could only set up 6 stations, and we had 6 more. And so since he was covered and we weren't, we decided, well, we'll take our chances to get some other observations at the very low altitude. Just see what we could do. Next slide. So this shows the the path across Saudi Arabia. Paul's already talked about that, so next slide. Now this shows the path across, the path went right over the city of Bengkulu, which is a fairly large city on the southwest coast. So they have regular air service from Jakarta. So our flight, we flew into Jakarta and spent overnight there, and then the next day we met Wirahata Putrawan, who's from the Lembang Observatory, and he traveled with us the whole time we were there and helped with all the local arrangements. We were very fortunate with his support. I wanted to do something in Bengkulu like Paul had done in Saudi Arabia to get some local support, but Bengkulu has no astronomy infrastructure at all. And there's a university there, but we were never able to make contact even with, I was hoping maybe a physics teacher or something. But it turned out the event was very difficult in that area because it's a tropical area, so the skies are not very clear. If it had been in Alice Springs, we could have done it. It would have been a snap. But the 4-degree altitude was only just under 5 degrees was the altitude right along the coast. So we had 4 stations planned with a cult watcher, or actually 2 of them were we figured we could set up 3 stations where Joan and I would run separate stations and Wira could run another one. We had lots of dark time at least, and we were able to use the moon as a pre-point, which turned out to be necessary because it was the only thing you could easily see at that low altitude. So the pre-pointing was successful, but the results were, the dots, the black dots, show the sites we actually occupied, and unfortunately, Joan, who was right on the predicted center line, could not see. The star was never visible in her video. For Wira, the star was faintly seen. It was fairly bright as it first entered the field, but it got fainter and fainter. But you could still see the star on the video up to about 20 seconds after the occultation. And it looked like the star did disappear, and through Herculean efforts, Tony George was able to pull out an occultation to establish that there probably was an event there, but of course, under the conditions, it wasn't a definite thing. At my side, I went down here, which is this little peninsula at the south, to the south of the city of Vancouver, is an area, is the ports of Vancouver, where they ship out lots of coal that's mined inland, and it's shipped out to India and China. There are lots of operations going on there, trucks with, and coal dust and things, but I still had a good view. It was the only place where there weren't trees blocking the horizon. There was a big open field where they'd sometimes store coal, but there wasn't any, and so I had a good view. And I was able to record the star just barely entering the field of view, but lost it when it was about 6 degrees altitude. So no observation. This was the only one. Next slide. So this shows Paul Maley's chord, the purple chord on the top of the circle, and the green line down here is intersecting the path is a miscord. I don't know if it was one of the miscords where the observer was on the wrong star or not, but you can see Wira's chord kind of matches, not real well, but I think it establishes that Wira probably did actually have the occultation, but to quantify it, to say anything about the shape of Dagmar, no. The observations weren't good enough to do that. Anyway, I thank Tony George and Brad Timerson for their ROTI and occult analyses to come up with this data. And of course, they've helped for all of the Australian events that I'm going to be talking about later. So next slide. Better go quickly here. This just shows pictures of our Dagmar sites. Next slide. And 2 nights later, the asteroid Julietta called it Delta Sagittarii over Java. So 2.9 magnitude star. So it was really great we had these 2 events. But next slide. And this one was at high altitude now. And Yogyakarta is one of the larger cities in Java. Several million people live there. And so we decided to take the 7 mighty minis that we had in recorders, very similar to the equipment that Paul Maley took to Saudi Arabia. Next slide. This just shows, just like Paul Maley's has one teaching people how to use the mighty minis in Jeddah. We had a similar session in Yogyakarta with the members of the Yogyakarta Astronomy Club. It's quite a large group. Next slide. This just shows a whole sky chart that I made showing where Delta Sagittarii was in the teapot. and had another chart where all it was that star was underlined, and said this is what you're actually going to see. So unfortunately, it was too cloudy to do any previous night pre-point, checkout. But these at least were amateur astronomers who knew the sky reasonably well. So we plan to set up stations north and south of Yogyakarta, as shown in the graphic here. So one south of Yogyakarta, one just south of the southern limit, and then the one right at the southern limit was in the city. And then there were these other stations to the north. But it was clear that there was going to be a lot of cloudiness over the area, and the satellite photos and the way that the clouds seemed to be forming, I thought it looked like we would have better chances if we went to the west. So I took the third station here from the top. We decided to move it to the west, and also and then also Wira and I, and Joan and I, with another driver, went to a site even farther west, a little bit north of the center line. As it turned out, it was cloudy at all of the sites from Yogyakarta up to Semarang, except that there was this one group in near the northern limit of the occultation. One of them had a DSLR camera, so although it actually rained at that site, the one with the DSLR camera decided to drive separately then to Semarang. And at Semarang, he got out of the clouds and made an observation with the DSLR camera. So that observation and the two that we made in the west were the only ones where the sky was clear and we were able to observe the star. So the sky wasn't completely clear. There was lightning going on with thunderstorms around the horizon, but at the high altitude of the star, it was clear. But all three of us had no occultation, so the path shifted somewhere else. We don't know exactly where. This just shows one of the pictures. So next slide. Yeah, go on to the next. Hello? Can you go to the next slide? Okay. Oh, there you go. Okay, got the next slide. Then the day we returned from Indonesia on May 29th, there was an occultation of a 6th magnitude star by Venus, and we tried to observe it from Steve Hutchin there with the 8-inch telescope that we borrowed from the Astronomical Association of Queensland. But unfortunately, the strong glare from Venus defeated our attempt to video record that event. Next slide. Then on June 5th to the 7th, we drove north from Brisbane to Cairns because there was a good event near Cairns that we wanted to try to observe a few nights later, actually 2 events. And we stayed overnight at Rockhampton, and Steve Kerr lives there, and so we were able to visit him in the evening. And then we drove to Townsville the next day and then on to Cairns. Just the second night we were doing our long distance driving, we unfortunately hit a kangaroo just 10 kilometers south of the city of Bowen. So when that kangaroo was almost as large as this figure shows here on the, it's almost to scale on the map it seemed, but no, actually, it caused damage to our front bumper, but the car, we were able to still drive it. So but we had to swap it then at Cairns. But we got a rude awakening that in Australia at nighttime you have to slow down and don't overrun your headlights, because kangaroos can jump out at any time. Um, but fortunately, in some parts of the country, in northern territories, they have really wide shoulders, so you can really see any problems a long time in advance. Next slide. This just shows the 6th magnitude star by the asteroid Gradia, the path that we wanted to observe. This was supposedly the dry season there, but that's just a relative term in the tropics. They actually had a drought during the earlier wet season, but then it seemed to change and the season sort of shifted, so it actually rained most of the week that we were in Cairns, and it was cloudy across the whole region. There was no hope of observing this event. Next slide. Also on this event then, the second paragraph here, just a night after that Gradia occultation, there was a partial grazing occultation of Uranus by the 26% sunlit moon on the dark side. So we wanted to video record that, but the same damn weather pattern prevented us from doing anything. Dave Harold had clear skies down in Murrumbateman, north of Canberra, and recorded the reappearance of the planet there. Anyway, we visited the sites in that area, and then we left to drive to Alice Springs. Next slide. This just shows the route driving to Alice Springs. The underlined places are places where we stopped overnight. Just let you read this. The Hughenden, this little town, was sort of interesting because they discovered plesiosaur skeletons around that town, and they had a big statue of one, of course. And in Richmond, where we stayed, they actually had a little museum too, because there were also some fossils there. But there are other interesting things along the way. Next slide. Just shows a few pictures of the road along Alice Springs, showing one of their infamous road trains that have 3 or 4 carriages. The only limitation on those trains is that they can't be more than 53.5 meters long. I don't know how they came across that. An interesting Devil's Marbles National Park, and this is just a view showing Alice Springs, and the top right picture from the highest mountain in the area, Mount Gillen, which we climbed just a few days before we had to leave to come back to the U.S. on an emergency trip. Next slide. Just 2 nights, or the night after we arrived in Alice Springs, there was this occultation of a 12th magnitude star by the large asteroid Adiona. Next slide. It was kind of early in the evening, so we set up one station about 30 kilometers southwest of Alice Springs as a remote station with a 10-inch suitcase telescope, and then used the one of the Maxis with an integrating camera at the south station. And at the same time, Richard Williamson, a colleague of Bill Hanna's, who works at a store that he runs in Alice Springs. He sells telescopes, but lots of other things that people in that area, need for traveling around the outback. So he has an observatory, and he ran the 20 centimeter scope that Bill Hanna had left behind. So we had 3 stations here, but all of them had no occultation. Next slide. This just shows set up the suitcase telescope, and John Broughton designed and built that, and gave a presentation, and a presentation about it was given at the 2011 IOTA meeting. I encourage you to go back to that IOTA meeting presentations page and see that, to see details of this very useful and interesting telescope. It's been a real workhorse for us. And this just shows one of the paver mounts that I'll talk about separately at the next talk. Next slide. Um, the next event on our agenda was the occultation of a 12.3 magnitude star by Pluto on June 29th, the brightest occultation, I think, since 1989 or something. But professional astronomers had many stations with much better equipment in New Zealand and Tasmania, so we decided to try to observe from 2 stations in Victoria to try to see, just on the southwest coast of Australia, in case the path shifted north, or to see a dimming in the atmosphere. I considered Tasmania at the last moment, but the weather forecaster for Tasmania that I talked to that morning before the event discouraged me from what he was saying about the forecast. So it looked like it was too chancy to do that. But we should have gone there because the occultation was actually recorded from near Hobart in Tasmania by one of the professional teams. Next slide. So anyway, we flew to Melbourne from Alice Springs, and then we rented a car in Melbourne, and shows the drive we drove about almost 300 kilometers, I think, to the northwest to the New South Wales border. But when we got there at Wodonga, there were clouds just starting to form. It was pretty clear during most of the drive, but we got a new weather forecast there and talked to Dave Harold, and it looked like they were forecasting fog in that area and clouds forming, and they were already forming when we arrived. So we turned back, and because they were saying it was going to be clear weather in the western part near the city of Bendigo. It looked like it was pretty good. We got to the city of Uroa, that's near the center of the figure there, and that's where we got a motel and tried to observe. But just an hour before the event, clouds moved in there, and so Joan, we pre-pointed a telescope on a maxi there, and Joan tried to run that. Well, I took the 10-inch suitcase telescope and drove down to Merton, where I got out of the clouds, but then ran into fog in the Dividing Range Mountain there. So I went back and actually got into clear sky some 15-20 minutes before the event, but wasn't really able to get get onto target well enough to get a good observation. I actually got on target a little bit before and after the event, but not during. So unfortunately, this important event was a failure for us, but fortunately, the event was quite well observed by the professional astronomers and some of the amateur astronomers, especially in New Zealand. And Dave Harold got the southernmost negative observation from Murray Bateman, about 100 kilometers north of our location relative to the path. Next slide. And this just shows the occultation that was observed from the Sophia Observatory that flew out of Christchurch and got near the center line and got this nice central flash. Next slide. Our next big effort was for an occultation of 11.9 magnitude star by the asteroid Align. So there were no other observers for this event, which was the case for most of the events we were trying, so we had to try to cover the whole path ourselves. Next slide. This shows the 6 telescope stations that we set up and shows the result that we had a miss at our northernmost attended station, and also a miss was recorded at the station, 2 stations south of that. We've numbered them since we deployed them from south to north. We numbered them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So the number 4 and 6 had a miss. And unfortunately, the batteries failed at all the other stations because the temperature was quite cold that night, only got down to about 3 degrees Celsius. And we had some Aussie hand warmers, but they were wimpy compared to the American ones, and we just didn't protect the batteries well enough to survive those conditions for a long period of time. So Richard, we talked about that, and Richard Williamson said, well, I'll give you some big batteries, that we could take in the next condition. But fortunately, after that, the events were all warm enough that we didn't have to worry. Next. Anyway, some other events will be discussed in my next talk because they involve using the paver mounts for, and I have a separate talk about going to Hawaii in the middle of our trip here. And then on the evening of the 2nd, after we left Alice Springs, Richard Williamson actually observed an occultation. It had about a 6-second event by the asteroid Kolga that he video recorded at his observatory with some equipment we left with him. But inadvertently, he wrote over the recording of that event for another event that happened a bit later. So he was quite disappointed, devastated at that. But he did get another positive. It's another event a month later. Next slide. Then on September 5th, we had an occultation of a 12.4 magnitude star by the asteroid Artemis. This was a pretty faint star, but we got a fairly good astrometric position. But at the northern and southern stations, we used integration intervals which were a little bit too large. They detected the occultation, but it was just poorly timed with the former errors. So I think the shape solution is not very good, not really good enough to tell us more about the shape, but we did get an astrometric result, is what I would say from this event. Next slide. The next event was 100 Hecate. After we'd had all these failures, the Bertholda event wasn't very successful, which happened on July 31st. I'll talk about the next one. But here we had a good 10.0 magnitude rank 75 event, which also went northwest of Alice Springs, which is accessible on this Tenamai Road that is a one-lane paved road for the first 100 kilometers. And then it turns into a dirt road the rest of the way to the northwest. And we just had a rental car that doesn't have a good four-wheel drive capability, so we had to stick mostly to the paved roads. The next slide. For this event, we were able to set up 8 stations along the Tenamai Road, and Richard Williamson also observed at his observatory. It shows 10 stations here, but the one was at our apartment in Alice Springs, and we didn't run a station there. So there was not really that secure right in the town. But in the outback, there's no problems. You just put the stuff behind trees, and no one ever sees it. And finally, this time, we had a complete success. The 3 northern stations had no occultation, as also Richard did farther south. But our 5 other stations were all positive, resulting in a good profile. We were really lucky, though, because it was partly cloudy. And in fact, at the number 3 station, this is at the number 3 station, the first 3 minutes of the video recording, we had a 6-minute timed recording. The first 3 minutes were dark. There was no stars or anything because of clouds. And then just 10 seconds before the occultation, the clouds parted. You could see the star field. It was correctly pointed. The target star disappeared, and then it reappeared again, perfect occultation recording. And about 30 seconds later, the clouds came over and wiped it out again. The other stations had clearer conditions. Next slide. This shows the nice profile we got from this event. So we were very happy to have this great success. Next slide. Um, this just shows our telescopes as we put them in the car for traveling to the Hecate site, and shows walking along this Tenamai road for one of the stations. Next slide. All these events I'm talking about now were sort of ordinary in that we had sufficient dark time to set them up. Like that Hecate event occurred at about 2:30 in the morning, so we had enough time to set up all those stations. This just talks about some other side trips that we took. We visited a number of areas around Alice Springs. All the underlying places are places we visited. The one place we haven't seen is a place called Goss's Bluff, which is one of the largest astroblems in Australia, where they claim a comet, but probably just a large meteorite or asteroid has created a central peak area that's about 8 kilometers across, and there's a larger area that's been mostly weathered away that they figure the actual impact crater was some 50 or 30 kilometers across, something like that. But there are other meteor craters, the Henbury meteorite craters that we've seen, and of course we went to Uluru, the Ayers Rock, and there are other interesting formations around there. Next slide. Just shows some pictures of some of these things. This shows the meteorite craters. There's one at a place called Palm Valley that's only about 200 meters away from the car park there, and so I hiked up. It's up on a ridge though, and you have to climb over this ridge to get to it off of the planned trail that they have there. But this was discovered several years ago, and this is a view of that crater about itself about 200 kilometers across. And then to the bottom there is a picture of the Henbury crater. Next slide. Okay, actually I think this is the first version of my talk. I had a second version that I think is up on the web now where there are several more pictures. So I encourage you to see that. This shows the nice picture of Ayers Rock. We spent quite a bit of time hiking in that area, and very interesting. Next slide. Near Ayers Rock is this other formation called Kata Chuta, or the Olgas it's called. And then there's also a Table Mesa, large mesa that's called Mount Connor, that's about 100 kilometers east of Ayers Rock. And it was interesting, I was able to find 2 places where you could see all 3 features, just barely on the horizon for some of them, but at the sunrise observing spot for Ayers Rock, you can actually see the part of Mount Connor sticking above low on the eastern horizon. Next slide. This shows the September 5th occultation of another faint star by Artemis. Next slide. I think we already went through this one. How did this? Yeah. I was meant to put in something else. Anyway, so this shows our stations. And the next slide, I already talked about I already showed this shape model. Next slide. And then on September 11th, we had an occultation of a 9.2 magnitude star by the asteroid Asterope. This was a rank 100 event. It was north of Alice Springs quite a ways. It was an ideal event for remote stations with over 10 hours of dark time. The event occurred a little bit before sunrise, about almost 5 a.m. in the morning. So we devoted all of our resources to this high rank of relatively bright events. Although most stations had to be picked up after sunrise, the small systems were hidden well enough that we could do that. So there just isn't, there's almost no traffic on this major highway between Darwin and Adelaide that goes across the so-called Stewart Highway that goes across central Australia. At night, you just have maybe one car every hour or two. So this shows us preparing in our apartment, preparing telescopes and setting everything up. We numbered everything, tried to be as organized as we could with the equipment. Um, using the next slide. Um, anyway, we use as a base this little place called Wycliffe Well, where they have a roadhouse, but they style themselves as the UFO capital of Australia. And you can see, this was sort of a big thing in the 1970s, apparently, when they set it up, that the current owner just sort of runs the place, and the person who really knows about UFOs is in Alice Springs now. But anyway, we stayed there for 3 nights so that we would have time to sleep in during the day, get rested enough before the event, because it was a fairly long drive north from Alice Springs. So we saw no aliens, but we did see mice in our room and cows, plus their pies, in the walkways around the place. Why they let the cows just wander around and don't fence them out was we never did understand. But anyway, next slide. Now this shows our plan. Wycliffe Wells, we had a site about 3 kilometers north of there in the bush, and all of these stations were hidden that way. And we set up 11 stations showing completely across the 1 Sigma zone and a little bit north of the 1 Sigma zone. And we wanted to go farther north because the PPMX catalog from the star catalog comparison that Brad had prepared for us and some of the other catalogs indicated that the path, if it's going to shift, it'll probably shift to the north. And Steve Preston, I forgot the T there, confirmed that a north shift was likely based upon some other catalogs that he looked at after the occultation. Anyway, we ran these stations all the way up to a place called Churchill's Head. So we had 320 millimeter maxis, all 6 of our 80 millimeter middies, and used a mini with an integrating camera and also the 10-inch suitcase scope. So the 3 southern stations had no occultation. And Station 4 was the only one that failed. We didn't have fresh batteries. We should have. That was our mistake. To run the camera, it was using a Waytec 902H camera, and that camera just gave a bunch of squares, so a strange pattern. It was clear it just was failing with being out in the long time with weak batteries. But everything else worked. Next slide. So anyway, the 7-3 had a miss, but we got 7 positives then, which is our best effort ever. So we were really happy with this event. So this shows the plot from the work that Brad and Tony George did. So you can see the northernmost chord, it was good. We got up there to get the short chord there. The northernmost and southernmost chords were VTI time inserted, but I think I'm going to buy a couple of more VTIs while we're in the U.S. before we go back, because we clearly it looked like we have a problem with some of the Canon ZR camcorder clocks. So we're going to do some future tests, but it takes all-night testing to do that. At least you don't have to do all the driving like you have to do between this event. But what I want to do is to quantify the drifts from linearity, and I think hopefully they'll be repeatable. We'll do 3 or 4 of those tests, and then we might be able to quantify those with the particular cameras used. We know what they are, and see if we might be able to improve that. But this event occurring on September 11th, 2015. Was sort of an interesting event for anniversary for me, because it's the 30th anniversary of the International Cometary Explorer spacecraft to the comet Giacobini-Zinner on September 11th, 1985. That was the first ever spacecraft encounter with a comet My colleague Bob Farquhar and I designed the orbit for that spacecraft. It was a repurposed mission for a satellite that was monitoring the solar wind, but we figured out a way to use the moon with 5 lunar swingbys to send it off to that comet. So it was quite an achievement at the time. And I've done a lot of interesting things with Bob Farquhar over the years. And unfortunately, he's dying now, and that's the reason I'm back in the U.S. To try to take care of things, for him during his last days. Anyway, next slide. This just shows another side trip we made just for sightseeing trip to see the Kimberley. It's a very beautiful area. The Wolf Creek crater, which is one of the more best meteorite craters in Australia, is there. There's also the Piccaninny crater, which is in the Bungle Bungle National Park, a very large crater that Eugene Shoemaker proved was meteoritic in origin. This Lake Argyle, and one feature we really liked there was the Dunham River. So it's a river that's almost not quite as large as the Ord River, which they dammed up to form Lake Argyle, one of the largest reservoirs in Australia. Next slide. This shows several pictures in the Kimberley showing pictures of the very unique formations in the Bungle Bungle. One from the air. We took an air flight to see it from the air and also from the ground. And then this shows a picture of the plane that we were on landed in Lake Argyle, and you can see a crocodile in the lower middle part of the picture there. And another interesting place we went to, El Castro, where we had to cross the Pentecost River, and this we did get a good, capable, high clearance four-wheel drive vehicle that could navigate through this crossing. Next slide. Just show some more pictures from the Kimberley, the panorama of the Wolf Creek crater, and the lower one shows the center of the crater, and then the Piccaninny crater is in the distance here. You can see the edge of the crater across the center of the field, and then there's the Piccaninny Gorge is this large gash in the middle. It's unrelated to the meteor crater, but the meteor crater is very old. They figure it's been eroded down by about 2 kilometers. Finally, on October 8th in Central Australia, the thin crescent moon, called it Venus, providing an opportunity to record the ashen light on the dark side for about 30 seconds before. We recorded the event with a 10-inch scope and got up to 2-frame integrations before the background light was too bright. And we also recorded a 9.8 magnitude star reappearance quite well after the event, showing the sensitivity. But we saw we had about 30 seconds of time when the dark side of Venus reappeared before the sunlit part came out, and we saw no evidence of the ashen light during that observation. You can see the video at this, Brad Tiberson has posted it and you can see it on the videos on the IOTA site, his IOTA site. Next slide. Just anyway, in the future, when we return to Australia, we'll spend about a week in Alice Springs to get ready to move down to Canberra, where we'll spend most of the rest of the time to see the rest of more of the country. On March 9th next year, we hope to try to observe the total solar eclipse in northern Indonesia. And on March 25th to 28th in Sutherland, a suburb of Sydney, we will attend the National Astronomy Convention of Amateur Astronomers, National Australian Convention of Amateur Astronomers, and also TTSO 10. And then shortly after that, we hope to return to the U.S., hopefully in time to observe the April 5th occultation by 216 Cleopatra. Next slide. This just shows a map of Australia showing all the places I've talked about. The green squares are places where we newly visited on this trip. The orange square from Brisbane to Cairns is what we kind of repeated our 1986 trip there. The red squares are places where we've visited in the past. And the blue square is where I've been, but William and Joan haven't been there. We hope to try to put in more squares during the rest of our stay to blanket the country more and see more of the interesting sights of this country. Almost as large as the U.S., about the same size, and there's lots of interesting things to see there. Next slide. Anyway, when we leave, we're going to leave our telescopes there with other observers. We greatly appreciate John Broughton's special telescope design skills and Richard Williamson's ability to fix the equipment for us in Alice Springs. This is just support that I haven't had before in the U.S., but I hope to get when we get back to the U.S. I hope I can get help in doing these kinds of things with telescopes for occultations and just fixing things in general. So especially, I hope we can manufacture John's suitcase and paver mount scopes in the U.S. Next slide. This shows we do plan to come back to Australia sometime in the future. This is on October 13th. Next year there's going to be an occultation of Regulus by Adiona, so another chance to see this first magnitude star occulted. We'll try it probably from the Caroline Islands and then maybe spend a few weeks in Australia, depending upon what other things are going on there. Next slide. In 2017, we hope some Australians can join us to observe the Great American and Total Solar Eclipse. And next slide. And 2 months after that, we will be in Adelaide to attend the International Astronautical Congress. Anyway, I think that's the last slide of this talk. And rather than give questions, or since we're a little bit late, why don't we just go on to my second presentation.